there are not many people in the world who don't need introduction, but certainly Eric Schmidt is one of those people today. I mean, Google is the it company, I guess, at the moment.
As opposed to the IT company.
Yeah, as opposed to the IT company. It is the it company. And so first, thank you, Eric, for coming. And, I know your days are long and hectic, and to come and spend some time with a bunch of us eggheads and a few people doing real work is very kind of you. I'm going to put a few questions to him, but I won't be very long. And mostly this is for us to have a conversation. But let me throw out 3 questions, and then we'll open it up. I guess the first question is, obviously Google's a web-based company, maybe the first almost purely web-based company. That's where it makes its money. That's its business model. But how is the ethos of the web, its openness, its transparency, the speed, how has that shaped the way you manage or Google is managed internally? How do the internal management processes, the values, the way decisions get made, the way projects get approved, the way resources get allocated, how has that been influenced and shaped by the kind of ethos of the web itself?
First, thank you guys for having me. I want to make sure everybody knows we have 2 of our most senior executives here in the audience, right? Hal and Marissa over there. So they're going to help me out if I get in trouble. I think these are interesting questions, and it's interesting the way you ask the question as though there was a list of the answers to such a question rather than something that simply emerged. And I think the first answer is that it emerged. It wasn't planned. And it emerged because people still thought they were in graduate school, even though they weren't. They didn't understand that the company was different from university. And so many of the answers to this question have to do with if you take an academic culture and you try to apply it to a business, you sort of get these outcomes. So it's much simpler than it appears. Now, the porousness is a characteristic of high-performing organizations today because smart people want to work with other smart people and they want to be informed. And I think everybody here understands that the model of governance has gone from hierarchical to more sort of empowered. The problem is that a whole generation of managers don't actually want to empower anybody. So I have the benefit that no one lets me do anything, right? Because they're all busy doing their stuff, and they'll say, oh, well, maybe we will, maybe we won't. And that's sort of part of the culture. We spent for years saying, well, we wanted this product. Well, no one wants to build it. You'd think we'd have some sway around here.
You'd think.
And so you sort of give up and you say, well, the culture then defines the outcome. And the culture is one around innovation. And so the culture can be understood as a ship and iterate culture with transparency for what people are doing. And that model scales pretty well. It's amazing how many smart young people there are who just want to keep doing stuff. And we have a hiring process that really does bring in people who really self-select into that group. So it leads to lots of chaos, right? So and that's been well reported on. But every once in a while it produces these amazing achievements. So I think that the culture of the web can be seen as this sort of enormously low barrier to entry to providing web services and so forth and so on. The same dynamic is true. I've always believed that people are the same regardless of generation, language, race, culture, what have you. They want the same things. I suspect if you go to a quote, boring old company, they also want to be empowered. The culture just doesn't allow them to do it.
So, you said that in a way Google was modeled on a university. There's a lot of people who work here for universities, and they're a little worried to hear you say that, to be frank. But so obviously, there's some core set of values that have been taken across. That's obviously not the whole story, but perhaps you could expand on that point a little bit, and then talk maybe about some of the practical mechanisms that tie Google together internally. We all know that there's the span of control in Google is, 1 to 50, 1 to 60, but it's something that's almost inconceivable in a typical organization. So what keeps these things from spinning out of centrifugally?
First place, if you have enough direct reports, you can't manage them. That was the goal, right? So it's all sort of consistent. Let's put it in context and say that almost all of these decisions were made by the early founding team. And the early founding team literally came from graduate school and so forth, and they're of that generation. And I remember my first week coming in And listening to this and thinking we were having just wonderful academic debate because every issue was debated as though it was new. So it's easier to see it as I'm coming in as a classically trained executive. There was an executive that I wanted to hire, and I figured I was a CEO. You could hire an executive, and this particular executive was very, very talented, didn't know quite what to do with her, and we had this discussion, and everybody said no. And I remember walking outside and looking at Susan Wojcicki, who is one of the founding product managers, and looking at her and say, why can't I get this fucking hire through? And she looks at me and she goes, well, they treat everyone that way. It was as though the Borg was defining me.
And you were used to being everyone as a problem.
That's right. And so what I realized, and the reason I tell you that story is that it tells you that the culture drove the behavior and that I was simply one of the other players. And I can't now tell you what value I added or subtracted to the culture, but I know that I was inserted into it. So this cultural notion, it really has driven Wayne Rosing, one of the early executives, used to call it the Borg. It just expands, right? So I think as academics, to the degree that those of you who are looking at this, try to figure out the things that will scale to arbitrary size. Empowerment is one, communication is another, and then a sort of sense of how quickly you can move. I can't characterize it more than that. It does matter the people that you hire. Larry one day said, we're hiring all these people. And I said, well, we are hiring all these people. And Larry said, well, how do you know they're any good? And I said, well, I think they're pretty good. And Larry goes, well, why don't we inspect all the offers? Because hiring is how bad organizations get set, right? These people are hired one after another. So he established a principle that we would look at each and every one of the people we hired, which we do today, which is unheard of for a company of our scale. And normally, basically, managers hire whoever they want, and they always hire their friends, and you get this declining, this sort of declining value curve. Another example. Larry and Sergey and I. Yeah, we every Monday we look at every offer that goes in the company. It's about
the CEO level looks at everyone.
Yeah, every offer in the company. We make somewhere between 60 and 100 offers a week. We do them on Mondays. You get hired on Mondays. You can show up whenever you want, but you get hired on Mondays.
You're not looking individually. You're looking at.
We do paperwork and so forth. Another example was again, this is my first 6 months. So before I'd shown up, they had decided to have management, which was a new concept. Remember, we're in a university. So there were 5 engineering executives who had been promoted. And these were perfectly nice people as far as I could tell. So after a few months of having executives, Larry and Sergey decided that they didn't like having executives anymore. So they decided to get rid of them. And I said, well, first place, these are wonderful employees. And second, we need some executives. They said, no, we don't. So they did what is called the disorg, right, where they literally got rid of the management. And everyone then reported flat to one individual, which was about 150 people. Because their standard was so high that they thought that they were going to end up with a sort of, because they picked the people who had some management experience. That was an interesting experience. So from then on, we hired people not based on any management experience whatsoever, because we figured it was pessimal. So experience was negative, right, not positive, because if you came in with experience, you would apply it to hold models to new problems. So lots of stories like that. And by the way, it takes founders, it takes courage, and it takes youth, to be very blunt.
And maybe a blank sheet of paper, in some sense.
Yeah, and you're starting out. And today, those are not reproducible, but they were at the time.
So let me just come back to that one question. So now, given that very broad span of control, given that sense that kind of like talking to the dean, they let you make decisions when they want to, and everybody has a pocket veto. What allows that to work? I mean, where does the coherence come from? Where does the sense of responsibility come from? How do the key decisions get made?
There are a number of benefits. One is that the laws do apply to every human, and so they can't, they actually do have to self-organize around legal activities. And I say that because you can imagine a situation in which just a randomness occurred. But there's a set of things people can't do. They can't violate the law, they have to behave properly, and so forth, and we tell them that. And that seems obvious, but it's worth stating. Another thing has to do with the fact that there's a strong shared vision, and that strong shared vision is really about innovation in the web, and that's celebrated, and that I think helps a lot. And then the other thing, frankly, is we have executives who've grown up in the company, so they form that internal culture. Those are sort of the normal answers. I think what is most interesting about Google is the way in which the culture is expressed is very difficult to describe it, but when you're in it, you know exactly what it is. It's very strong. And people talk about it as don't do any evil, and you could be serious without a suit and so forth. But there's a very specific model that works. Here's another example. So Marissa comes in and says, like, we have too many projects. And I go, like, what do you propose? And so she says, well, we'll have a top 100. And so I said, perfect. It's a good idea. So she does an analysis, and we have 250 projects. But we call it the top 100 list. It's fine. Here's the top 100 list of 250 projects. So I said, well, how would you propose to do this? And she says, well, what we'll do is we'll rank them 5 through 1 of these, because we have too much stuff going on. I said, okay, well, this is interesting. So there was a rank. So I said, why don't you guys run off and rank everything? So they managed to rank everything except one project, which I then artfully split in 2 and put in the 2 different ranking points. So that scale, the top 100 process, worked for a while, because everyone sort of said, well, clearly we should have a priority list, and clearly we should share that. So after a while, that broke down. So I said to Larry, I need the tablets. Okay, you need to go to the mountain, you need to bring back the tablets, and you need to present them. And he said basically, no, he's busy. Like, doing what, right?
He has a 767, come on.
What are you busy, right? So a week or 2 later, he stays up all night and he writes the tablets, which is a very interesting talk. And I didn't care what the talk would be. I just wanted a talk. So I said, present it. And then call for self-organization. So a combination of a priority list and a call for self-organization, because people want to serve the company, worked pretty well. Another example, we didn't have a strategy, because again, the Borg is moving forward. It's just innovation, smart people, and so forth. So I said we should have a strategy. We had no product roadmaps. I mean, I'm used to as an executive having like multi-year products shipped. I had no idea what we were going to ship, but it was fine. It was working just fine. Don't complain, right? So we should have a strategy. So I'm in Larry and Sergey's office at the time, and Sergey has to run off to dinner, and he's up to something. So I said, Sergey, you only have 5 minutes. Tell me the strategy. He writes down the 5 things, right, and runs out. And Larry and I look at these 5 things. We say these are brilliant. We then spend an hour, evolving them. And there are things like that we'll only work on problems that affect, many, many people, large numbers of people. That our advertising system is self-organizing in that it's reasonably resistant to competitive attack because it's an auction-based model. There's things like that. Developers are key because we want to change the way in which people build for the web. And so then Larry then fills in all of the details. Sergey, meanwhile, shows up afterwards and says, beautiful, and then we're done. That's how strategy is done. So we wrote that, and so we had the combination of the tablets from Larry and the strategy document, and that's what we communicated. This works to a point. I think it probably does not work now because the company is simply too large. And I'm not sure what we do next.
And ultimately, not knowing Google's case, but ultimately, founders run out of vision. It happened to Scott McNealy. It happened to Michael Dell. It happened, you could arguably, to Bill Gates. So
they're not done yet.
All right. We'll take your word on that. Hey, last question before we just...
They walked in one day, and I said, like, okay, guys, we're kind of bored. What's going on? And they said, well, we've decided we have to enter a new business. I said, okay, well, that's, they're always interesting. They're always interesting ideas. I said, what is it? Manufacturing. I said, what are you going to manufacture, like computers or something? He said, no, we're going to manufacture refrigerators. And I said, what? But I'm not aware of any particular strategic thing. I said, well, we've been talking about using refrigerators and general machinery and connecting it to the internet. And I said, well, okay. And this went on for about 10 minutes. And then I realized that they had spent the whole day planning. This is a joke.
I see.
So you have to have a sense of humor about this. So the good news is we're not doing refrigerators.
There's been a lot of conversation today about the role of the CEO. One CEO here said we really need to blow up the office of the CEO, I think by which he means kind of that imperial sense of, here are the tablets, here's where the wisdom. I mean, what is your role like as a CEO of Google? How is it different than perhaps many of your peers in other large companies?
Well, the good news is it works. The first thing to know is that I largely share power with Larry and Sergey, and we decided to just say that rather than sneak around about it. They own a third of the company. Okay, if you were the CEO and the two founders own a third of the company, do you work for them or do they work for you? Let's go through this a little bit. Okay, any rational person walking into that, just be honest. Okay, much better to be upfront. So we did that. And the management team, as I described, has worked together for a long time. And everybody's sort of used to a model which is pretty much the wisdom of the crowds model. It goes something like this. Every issue is debated. There is no issue so small that you can't have a debate about it, and we'll debate it infinitely. Okay? Now, if you look at wisdom of crowds, the basic thesis is that that when you see a meeting, like we're sitting at this table, and you're the person running the meeting, actually, a bit of background. At Novell, we had this culture, what was called the culture of fear. And I didn't invent this. And basically what would happen is everyone would sit around the table and they would go, yes, right? And then they would immediately leave the room and they would backstab each other. And this was part of the pathology of the company. So clearly a bad model. So in our model, we want to get everything on the table. So you have to basically, as an executive, you have to wait until nobody's talking, and then you have to find somebody who's a dissident. And inevitably, if you find one person who's a dissident, there'll be another person who'll join them, and so forth. You don't get a good decision until you get to that point. So part of my job is to get to that point. Now, so one model that says is that the first thing is you have to make sure you get disagreements. Now, if that's all you do, you end up with a university, right?
Back where we started, exactly.
And so you have to do one other thing, which is you have to have a deadline. So I have two jobs. One way to think about my job is I have two jobs, two roles. The first is to make sure that every issue that's important is really debated to find not the common outcome, but the best decision, which eventually smart people will get to, after a lot of give and take. And the second thing is to put pressure to make it happen quick, because business is speed. So I think if you think of it in that context, then all these other arguments people make, and I've read them in management books, they don't really matter very much. As long as that's how as long as that's how it feels, you're going to get the best ideas. People are going to really be passionate about it, or they're going to get out, right? And we'll go from there.
All right, let's have some questions.
Eric, I teach at a business school, like a few of the other of us in here.
So, by the way, so do I. So I actually like business school.
Good. And we use Google as a case study to do
to teach about different aspects of new styles of management, innovation, and whatnot. And I found that when I teach a case about Google to especially executives from more traditional companies and industries, the immediate pushback I get is, that's interesting. There's really nothing there for us. This company is just too fundamentally different, DNA, industry, youth, whatever, from us. And I have, up till now, tried to push back very hard on that argument. The more I listen to you, the more I'm convinced that they're right and I'm wrong.
But even if they're right, it doesn't mean you shouldn't try to teach them to do better. Almost all of these people are struggling in cultures which are dysfunctional. Yep. Almost all of these people are in situations where the vast majority of ideas are not surfaced and no one listens to them. And their employees quit and they come work for us.
But are you are you optimistic that they can get closer to where you are?
Of course.
Okay.
It starts with listening. It has to do with curiosity. There is a style that's involved, and I think it can be learned. I think you guys, are some of the top teachers in the world. You should be able to teach this. I mean, if necessary, it should be remedial. Like, let's work on listening. You learn more by listening than by talking. It's a shock. Stuff like that.
Eric, thanks very much for coming out. We really all appreciate it. I was in a conversation with someone last week, actually a son-in-law who works for Adobe, and he said that Google is facing a real challenge that'll only grow as the years go on. That's the brain drain, with people that you all have trained and brought up to a certain level, and then they go off to some other startup or they start their own company or so forth. and of course this happened to Microsoft. Huge brain drain. What are you all doing to try to keep these employees who've really learned on your time and money and et cetera, and where they've now, because they've cashed in their options, money's not really driving them. They're looking for the next, whatever to conquer. What are you doing to help preserve your staff?
I'd like to quibble with the first half of your question rather brutally, if I may. When I was at Stanford Business School and they were sort of teaching me how to teach, one of the examples they used was Andy Grove. And Andy Grove, you can't basically put up one slide without him attacking every single premise. And he starts at the
We
first
have people
sentence.
like that here, by the way, but keep going.
And by the way, and he's very rough, and it works because it forces people to really surface their hidden assumptions. I was very impressed with this technique, although I was glad I was not subjected to it when I was that young. And one of the things that we do at Google that, again, these are things that can be easily copied, is everything has to be based on some fact. So we don't have an argument the way you phrased it. We start with, what's our turnover? Now, there is no question that there's a brain drain, but what you said, your premise of your question was completely false. It's mathematically not true. It's just not true, right? The number of incoming far exceeds the number of people leaving. The people who are coming in have higher or equal academic credentials to the people who are joining. They're at the same age as we hired and so forth. They're better trained. They're just as motivated. In other words, if you think of it in that context, it's not true. Now, so I think a way of the question that I would ask in replacement that I think is we're trying to get to is, how do you deal with these challenges? Because there is some turnover. And the answer is that fundamentally, people stay in companies because they want to have an impact. So every person who leaves the company either does so because they made too much money, and those people have largely, I think, left. And I understand that. They want to retire at the age of 30. It makes no sense to me, but that's their life. Or the more common case is that they're being mistreated by management. And let me give you an example of mistreatment. If you go to a small startup, you can do whatever you want. Whereas at Google, you have to deal with me, right? So am I the problem, right? Is the culture the problem? Remember, these are people who selected into the culture, so it's probably not that. It's probably something pretty local. So every time we see somebody leave, we say to ourselves, what is the thing that they're able to do that they care about that they can't do now? There's a tremendous arrogance in business about the power of executives over individuals. And in high tech, and I think many of you, I know Steve knows this very well, because of the venture firms he runs, we treat the people as though we have the only asset. Other companies say that. But I deal with all these business people, especially in private equity. Some of you have spent some time with that group. And they don't think of the people as the asset. They think of the business or the cash flow or so forth. Whereas we understand that in an innovation model, it's only about the people and it's only about the innovation engine. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I think it was important to say that whatever the answer to your question is, it will be determined by whether the innovative culture does scale. There are many benefits to being in a large company with a lot of money over a startup that's going bankrupt. And it may very well be that this Web 2.0 bubble that we're in now will draw some people out of the company, but bubbles eventually end. And in any case, we've not seen a significant increase in turnover ever. So I don't know whether it's the free food, the culture, or the smiling pictures of the founders or whatever, but people are staying.
I'm Keith Sawyer. I'm a professor and the author of a recent book called Group Genius. I was at a conference at Harvard in December where Kim Malone-Scott was speaking about the lack of management at Google.
She is the management at Google.
And she said, there is no one in charge of internet search. But Marissa was introduced earlier today as being in charge of internet search. So I wonder to what extent there is or is not management at Google.
I'd say that if there's a person in charge of internet search, it would be Marissa. What is Marissa's response? I have a meeting once a week with Marissa where she talks about internet search. So are you in charge?
As much as everybody is.
Marissa is a very good example because Marissa is particularly good. She has a number of exceptional skills, but one of them is she's very, very good at getting people right out of your universities and getting them to be very, very talented technical product managers. She did this even when she was at Stanford as a graduate student. So it's a model that she sort of pioneered in the company. So she has this group of people that she sort of invented that she commands, and they run around, and she reports on their activities. And then we pontificate on whether we like them or not. And within reason, then she goes back and sort of shapes what they're doing. So is that a rough description? And it's a lot. It's a huge amount of human management, right? Because and they're very young people. But the product decisions are often made by a 22-year-old, which is a little frightening. But they're the best choice.
Bhaskar, let's go Bhaskar, then we'll come back over there.
So while I have the mic, I'm going to ask you two questions. And both of them relate to your innovation portfolio, the top 100, and however many you squeeze into that 100. It's 250 or more. So question one, and this goes back to a conversation I was having with Hal yesterday. If I think about the top 100, it's, at least from the outside, it seems like one out of the entire portfolio is the big revenue generator for Google.
No, not true.
So as I
But that's
said,
not true.
from
That's
the
not
outside.
true.
So I just wanted to, to the inside perspective on how you think about,
Well, it's interesting that she and I did the top 100, and I tried to think, what is, because I'm still trying to behave like a normal executive in this culture. So I thought, well, how would I articulate as the 4 or 5 goals of the company? What's the number one goal of the company? It's end user happiness with search. Okay. So what's the number 2 goal? It's end user happiness with advertising. Okay. What's the number 3 goal? The construction of the Google network of partners to effectuate the first 2. Okay. What's the number 4 goal? To grow and scale the business, naturally as it grows. So I announced this, and everyone at Google said, "Brilliant." And then I realized that what's the job of a CEO? Maximize shareholder value, maximize revenue, right? None of the things that I'm supposed to be doing are the goals of the company. So I came up with an excuse, which is I have the head and the tail of the dog, and who's wagging which, right? So I now explain myself by saying that you will eventually get extraordinary returns for your shareholders and maximize advertiser happiness if all those things happen. I'll give you another example. There's a lot of business executives who get confused on what the goal is. And they think that shareholder value is the goal. Shareholder value is a consequence of the goal. A very good example of a positive example of this is Rupert Murdoch, who people say, and he's a very, very clever fellow, and I had dinner with him, talk to him all the time. He actually has a sense for what people want to read. So everyone is consumed with his business practices, and he did this, whatever. But the guy knows what his audiences want. Right? He figures everything else will follow. So why aren't all businesses run that way? Because many businesses are not very consumer focused. But if you're in a consumer business, you should be focused on your consumers. Put another way, you're in the magazine business, it really doesn't matter whether your advertisers are happy. It matters a lot whether you have readers. It's not a hard argument. So the reason I repeat this is this seems so obvious when I say it, but if you put a little test in your brain, and when you're watching a business, ask yourself, are they in fact maximizing the right thing? And in almost all cases, now that I sort of apply this little test, I'm pretty convinced that they're not.
What was the 4th goal again?
Just the scaling the business. So it used to be, scaling a $100 million business. Then it was growing and scaling a $1 billion business. Then it was growing and scaling a $10 billion business. The question of size of Google is an interesting one. So we had one offsite. Companies like to have offsites, so we had one. We had to have an offsite. I had to schedule one. I was a new CEO. We had it at Quadras. If you, so now the locals know where that is. And it's near my home, and we scheduled it at 10 because we don't start too early. And the management at the time shows up. Larry shows up roughly on time. Sergey shows up late because he's rollerblading into the meeting. So the young founders at the time sit there and they listen to all of this. And we have a relatively normal offsite. And then at 3 o'clock or so, I said, well, what do you guys think? And so Larry says, well, I've been working on my presentation. And I said, well, what is your presentation about? And he said, oh, it's the future of the company. I said, well, that's nice. Why don't you share it to us? I said, well, so he goes, okay. And he said, well, our goal is to be a $100 billion corporation. I remember this is a time when the company has no revenue, it's like near bankrupt and all that. And I go, do you mean revenue or valuation? And he goes, doesn't matter. And I thought there, and I go, I really made a mistake joining this company. The two founders don't know the difference between a $100 billion valuation, which could be a very small revenue company that's highly hyped, versus a $100 billion corporation with real revenue. So Larry presents a strategy which can be roughly summarized as the space that we're going to be in, is going to be very large. There will be at least one company that will be a large company in it, and the size of a large company in that space will equal $100 billion of either revenue or valuation. And I said, well, but, and at the end I said, well, I don't think you guys and I got on the whiteboard and I wrote down the difference between, PE multiple and so forth. And Sergey looks at Larry and says, should we tell him we were kidding? So, of course they understood it. Next, you had another question?
Yeah. So at the risk of abusing my ownership of the mic, let me ask a second question. And this has to do with, I like practically everybody else in the room, I absolutely love Google. And there are many parts of the Google site which I think are fantastic. They're cool. But I'm not quite sure that they, kind of intrinsically, make the world a better place. For instance, the street level view of my house, I think it's fine. I really enjoy seeing it. But and here's the aside. I'm part of a group called the Gene Partnership Project up in Boston, where we are trying to essentially, create a database of personalized health records, for future of personalized medicine. Now, if I think about one company that could potentially make that happen in the private sector, it's yours.
Well,
so I know.
By the way, Marissa's actually doing that.
Yeah, and I was aware.
So you'd prefer that she shift her resources from Street View to that project?
Yeah, exactly. So I was wondering how you think about allocating resources for Street View, which is a very difficult project, and personalized
Marissa,
health
what is your response?
Oh, well, one, we are doing the health record piece. So we launched it just last week. You can actually put your medical records online. And we actually think that it's really, our mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And I think that both Health and Street View fill those goals. Health is really, it's absurd. I don't know how many people here have actually even had a chance to touch their doctor's chart on them. Has anyone? Right? And I'm going on a trip this summer. I needed to call around and figure out if I can do for a tetanus shot. Took 4 calls to 4 doctor's offices. And I'm a healthy person, right? And it was just inordinately inconvenient. So, I really think that it's important to, in this day of information, it's unthinkable that this information that would be so useful to you and could have such an amount of good for you or for your family members lays outside of your reach. So this is really about getting that information, putting it in the user's hands where they can control it, they can direct it, they can get better health. So we're really interested in that space, and again, it fits squarely into Google's mission. And Street View, from our perspective, it's really fundamental. It is, how do you physically find something? Right? When you think about what it could actually mean, we had one of our PR executives said, last week she was late to a meeting, it was raining out, and she knew it's the restaurant with the yellow awning. She didn't have to get out of the block and go running down the street, right, making her even later and showing up soaking wet, right? So, you can actually physically know where you're going, and now we're starting to see things like, what can Street View do for driving directions? What if you could actually be driven there on your computer so you'd know exactly, I'm looking for a corner that looks like this, I'm going to take a right. What if you do that? So, Street View is a profound way of just finding something in the physical world.
I forgot to tell you about the autonomous cars that we're building that don't have drivers.
Yeah.
And they need Street View.
With the refrigerator.
We have another, by the way, we actually are building the autonomous cars thing. I'm not so sure I'm happy with that, but you never know. With Android, there's a demo where Street View is actually integrated with the GPS and the accelerometer in Android, so you can actually see a replica of your world in front of you using Street View. And it is the exact vision that Marissa just described. We don't know where it'll go, but it is. She just gave the keynote at our developer conference this morning, and we now have published APIs for people to use the Street View data to do interesting apps. We have no idea what people will do with that information. It's clearly very powerful. Some more questions. We have a lady, this lady here and this gentleman. Yes.
So, Eric and then Shashank.
I don't know if it's a matter of semantics, but or of the culture of Google, but each person from Google, yourself included, when they've described it, have described it as chaos. And I'm kind of interested on how one achieves such incredible superior performance from chaos.
Because you have smart people. I mean, chaos is possible in every organization. I mean, it really does matter who you have working for you. And you know, what happens is the HR people always write, you know, we value our employees and so on and so on. It's all crap, right? Basically, it's all about how do you go about bringing and attracting and motivating the top talent. And the top people want to work in creative organizations. It's true in many industries. And they know where they want to work. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Eric. My name is Shoshana Zuboff. I wrote a book called The Support Economy, Why Corporations Are Failing Individuals in the Next Episode of Capitalism. That's that. Important thing. Went upstairs before you were coming and to call home and talk to my kids. And my daughter got on the phone. She's 15. She's a genius. She's an environmental activist. And the first thing was not, you know, how are you or what? Mama, have you met Eric Schmidt yet? Now, she doesn't know, I really don't believe she knows the name of a single executive in any company on the planet except yours. And when I was describing this meeting to her and what I was coming to, you know, and why I was schlepping across the country and all of that, it was when I mentioned you that the light bulb went on and said, okay, Mom, you should definitely go. So why is this? Because she sits down.
I'm looking forward to meeting her.
She's a perfect employee for you. But she's only 15. She sits down at our kitchen counter. Her goal is to solve the climate crisis, and within a few hours, using Google, she has done literally dozens of pages of research on how to make the climate crisis the defining issue of her generation. She has created a blog. She's got all kinds of entries on the blog. Before she's done in that day, she's got people from all over the school, the community, and the country writing on the blog with her. And she's created a website. And again, before she went to bed that night, there was something posted on the website from a student in Denmark, all using Google. I'm telling you this because you are an intimate part of our family. You're in our lives. You're not only empowering the people who work for your company in all the wonderful, inspiring ways that you're telling us about, but as you well know, you and Marissa and everyone else, you're empowering millions of people on this planet to do things that they never could have dreamt of doing. Not just the search, but all these other things. Okay, now, you're a publicly traded company now. You inhabit the 20th century corporate form.
Sure.
That is not well known for wonderful treatment of its end users. In fact, and especially over the last 30 and especially over the last, say, 15 years, it's more widely known for a kind of ignoring, abandoning, and betraying its end users and its customers, its consumers, all those labels. So when I think about Google, I think about a revolutionary capability that is transforming at an intimate level the lives of so many people on our planet. But this revolutionary capability now colonizing an old form, a form that has a lot of problems, a form that some of us would argue, I'd be among them, is in demise, and that has become part of the problem, not part of the solution, for the people like my daughter and the other people on this planet who are hungry for empowerment and to be enabled to live their life the way they want to live it.
So can I turn that into a question?
I'm going to turn it into a
Okay,
question.
because we're going to run out of time.
I'm going
here.
to turn it into a question, but I have to have the preamble. Okay, so the question is, how do you think about this? Is this on your radar screen as a conflict? Google going forth 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, we don't know that Larry and Sergey are always going to be there. We don't know that you are always going to be there. Can you imagine yourself betraying these people? How do you reinvent the form so that that's not a possibility?
The good news is that I have a relatively straightforward answer. We understood the question that you asked, I think, remarkably well, and as part of our going public, we created a two-class stock system. And the early employees, which obviously include the founders, these executives, and a few others, have super voting control over the company, over any issue, not just mergers and acquisitions, which is unusual. In fact, it's not done anywhere else except for a couple media companies. And this has the effect that the current clowns running the company can run the company without regard to street pressure and without regard to, for example, what's going on today with Yahoo. And we put that in place precisely because we saw ourselves in a 10 or 15 year kind of time frame. And there's a tremendous concern that the quarterly pressures that are on companies is in fact causing them to make short-term rather than long-term comments. So we did insulate that. I'll give you one story about inspiration. So every day I get an interesting email or story from somebody about the impact on Google. Here's today's, okay, just randomly today. We have an employee named Vincent who is in a wheelchair. He was injured, a spinal cord accident, one of these tragic things 28 years ago. So it turns out that he decided to have the Google video people, who are very clever, do a video of him using his wheelchair. Because people, when they're injured, often don't know how to effectively use a wheelchair, and he is an engineer, so you have to use your wheelchair optimally if you live in it. And so he put it on YouTube, and he measured it, and he has 100% of his audience now watching it. He is the star of the wheelchair generation. And for him, that's the most important thing that's ever happened to him. It's more important than working at Google, more important than his business success, because he has lived through the grief and then the recovery. And it's very hard to value that more highly than he would. So anyway, more
Another
comments.
question? Terry, and then James.
So, Terry, I work for other power company, Gore.
Terry's the CEO.
So my question is, we have probably a similar challenge that you do of herding the cats, where you've got all this passion, all this smart people, and they also are very passionate about their ideas. And so how they're told their project isn't going to be funded and how you decide what's going to be selected is a huge issue from an empowerment. So I'm curious how you've managed that and not made it top down versus that, there's some understanding in the organization that all projects are not going to be funded and we have resource constraints in any organization.
Well, of course, we have the same problems. We do very, very tough product reviews. And this is something that we learned from Microsoft, and there are a few things Microsoft did well. And that's one of them. And we really, really get to the bottom of, is this a great product? And the typical cycle will be to be a product strategy process and a meeting. The technical executives are there, some of the key technical people, and they're very, very detailed. Is this really going to work? And they're often rejected based on the fact that they're just not good enough. It's rare that we cancel anything. Marissa, it's interesting, Marissa is one of the people who, when she took over one particular project, working with me, said, this is not going to work. And she had the courage in the company to, we seldom cancel things, but it's rare. And she has done it a few times.
James, and then Jeff. James? Okay. All right, either way. All right.
So obviously I'm very interested in everything you're saying about wisdom of crowds personally and the bottom-up stuff, but I'm also struck by and I'm not surprised by this because I think one of the reasons why it seems to work relatively well, the kind of empowerment bottom-up model, less than this sort of call it that shorthand, is because Google is full of smart people. So you kind of assume that everyone at the table, when you're trying to draw out the dissident opinions, is smart.
Can I just, so sure. There's a principle that Carnegie Mellon used that I put in place called the reasonable person principle. It's a simple rule. The other person in the company has to be assumed by you to be a reasonable person, even though you hate them at the moment.
Right. And I think that's my question, I guess, is, and you're talking about how important it is to hire smart people. do you have any thoughts about how or whether you can make this work, you could make this model work, the model that you use, in a company where you're not hiring from the talent pool that wants to work at Google? I mean, let's just assume that the vast majority of people aren't smart in the way that Google employees are, but we still want to create organizations that get the most out of those people and that actually tap the knowledge that people have. I'm just sort of wondering, how do you do that?
I don't want to sound so arrogant that I think that organizations are going to be successful full of the smartest and the brightest. The fact of the matter is we have organizations that have every kind of person, but everybody wants the same thing. They want to be heard. So let's start with the fact that, a typical example, when I was a young executive at Sun, we did a deal with AT&T, a series of deals. And the executive that was at the time a very powerful executive came to visit. I was 30 years old or something. And we're sitting around the room, and he basically stands up and he's meeting with us and he gives us a short speech. And his speech was so clear that he didn't ask any questions. It was further obvious that he didn't want any answers. So we saw no particular reason, because we're like arrogant ourselves, to bother giving him any feedback. So he got nothing out of the transaction because he couldn't listen. So independent of the specifics that we're talking about the Google management culture, why don't you simply work on listening? There's this myth, and it's unfortunately the particular disease is the U.S. presidency. We want a president who is all-knowing and all-seeing and goes to the mountaintop and makes the decision. It's derived from our model of kings, right? If you look at the math, and many of you have looked at this, it produces bad outcomes. You're much better off having a partnership, because the partnership is forced to at least mediate each other.
Okay, another question?
Jeff
and then Lenny.
Jeffrey Hollander from Seventh Generation. As you know, and I think everyone in the room knows the impact and potential of the company, I've always felt, and it's just my opinion, that the notion "do no evil" falls short, perhaps significantly so, of the potential and aspiration of the company. And I'm just wondering, having lived with that for some time, your reflection on that. Is it right? Is it?
It can be understood as forcing a conversation. Two examples. If we have a policy of do no evil, then if somebody thinks evil's occurring, it forces a conversation. Now, it's possible that your view of evil and mine might disagree, in which case we'll have an argument, and our argument will be followed in the way that I described. It'll be everybody in a room, there'll be a big argument, some kind of a deadline, hopefully we'll get the right answer. And in those discussions, everybody's a peer. Again, these are all things that can be copied in other companies. Another example is 20% time. We have a rule widely publicized that engineers get to do 20% of their time, do whatever they want. Now, the good news about these engineers is they're not that interesting, right? they don't go off and climb Mount Everest as well. Their interests are pretty narrow, and so the 20% time, they tend to work in stuff that's in their area of expertise, and they invent stuff that we hadn't thought about. So that's good. But that's not the real reason 20% time exists. The real reason it's 20% is because it forces a conversation with a manager who's over-managing. So I come to you and I say, the project is late, you guys have screwed up, my classic old management style. And you can sit there and you can say, Eric, I'm going to give you everything I've got 80% of the time. Forces the dialogue. It serves as a check and balance on this sort of command and control management that a lot of companies have.
So just as a follow-up, what 5-10 years from now, what hope do you have, or what aspiration do you have for the effect that Google has had on the world?
Well, first place, I hope it's positive. Information is powerful, and the technology platform that the web has provided for information is unprecedented. We have example after example after example, and all of you and we work in the information economy, right? a reasonable scenario over 5 or 10 years. First place, I hope the company does well, and I hope that I serve it well as in my role, and the founders do, and the executives, and so on and so on. But the fact of the matter is, it's a system. It's a system of innovation around this web information model. And what I hope will happen is that a set of new uses of information will just naturally creep in your lives. And all of a sudden, we'll always know the answer to questions. And we'll always, and what you'd like to be able with Google is you'd like to be able to say, what should I do tomorrow? A reasonable question. I'm always kind of confused what I should do tomorrow. And Google should be able to at least give me some suggestions. Seems reasonable, right? Another one, I've always wanted a product called the paper lengthening product. Submit a paper, make it longer. And it's recursive, okay? Another product I've always wanted is the product which, and the code name we use internally is serendipity. Basically, I'm typing, and then it says what I should be typing. Okay? And these are simple ideas. Why don't computers do that stuff for me? I mean, Marissa outlined the health vision. There's so many examples where the digital revolution, the ubiquitous nation of information, the notion of GPS, geolocation, these new platforms really do create a new set of apps. A couple more. Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Kevin?
Yeah.
And then Lenny. I'm sorry, Lenny.
Yeah, we keep forgetting Lenny. Sorry,
Kevin,
Lenny.
and come
Oh,
back
I'm
to
sorry.
Lenny.
Well, Lenny, go ahead if you have the...
Do you have the microphone there, Lenny? Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I have a question for you on what you think the future of the media that has any intelligent discourse is, and the role that Google plays in that. I'm a complete news junkie, and I may be the last person on the planet who actually reads newspapers and enjoys picking up a paper magazine, but everyone I know in each of those businesses says their business is completely dead, with the exception of Tom Stewart at the Harvard Business Review. And I'm curious what your view is about how is that going to evolve in a way that plays the important role that media does in encouraging an intelligent conversation?
This is a crucial issue. And here's an example where you have a confluence of business models, right? Where the consumer goal is not necessarily the same thing as the business goal. Let me observe that people are consuming more information now than ever, and they're paying for it less than ever. Okay, simple, easy to understand. Things like the Harvard Business Review, The Economist, magazines that are monthly seem to be doing generally quite well, unless they're broad. The more specialized, the better. There's something about that modality that works. They can monetize, they have good advertising. The hardest hit, as we all know, are regional newspapers, who lost both the value of advertising as well as classifieds. Now let me ask a question. Did anybody here read a newspaper this morning? Show your hands. Okay. Can somebody describe some of the ads in those newspapers that you read this morning? Anyone?
Yeah.
What's an ad that you saw?
They have bra ads for some reason in the New York Times.
Yeah, Kevin.
Why were you looking?
Now, by the way, I don't want to ask too personal a question, but are you or are you not in the market for bras? Okay. Thank you. Okay. This is a perfect example of an advertising having wasted his or her money selling you a product which doesn't look like you need. I mean, therein you see the problem, and it's a very difficult problem. I think the future of newspapers, which has been widely discussed, and I've been to a series of comments, it's really mixed. Most of the newspapers seem to ultimately being merged into larger brand companies. Washington Post, that's true. The Wall Street Journal is now really part of a larger brand company. And it may very well be that the brand, the consumer brand, has such value that even though they're not very profitable, and so forth. But things like the other regional newspapers, it's not obvious where they're going to go, where they're going to end up.
Would you mourn their loss?
Of course. Yeah, because you always lose you always mourn the loss of creative content.
The intelligent discourse piece.
Well, the problem is that because everybody here is educated and, excuse the term, relatively elitist in our views, it's very disturbing to discover that, for example, Huffington Post, which has actually got a lot of very interesting voices, makes all of its money from Britney Spears, right? The average person is actually more concerned about her than they are about the kinds of things that we care about. And newspapers were always an approximation between those two goals. But with the internet, you can actually subspecialize, right? And the fact of the matter is that this is a tension in society and something which is not good. So the fact of the matter is that this is a negative outcome from the internet. But I think the business outcome will be that there's a value of the brand, even if it's not monetizable, and those valued brands that are not monetizable will be combined with good businesses. The organizations that have no particular value of the brand and have high production costs and relatively little money will go out of business. It's a terrible outcome.
Okay, Kevin, and then I think that'll be, I'll ask one more.
So in your discourse and history of Google's management style, you made it very clear that there's sort of been a historical evolution, that the things that you were doing originally kind of just ad hoc by the founders has changed over time. You're doing things differently as it scaled up and as also as the environment changed. And so what I'm wondering is if the rest of the way Google does its actual products is very sort of essentially engineered, a lot of data testing, a lot of A/B tests, a lot of experimental approach. And so as you are sort of headed into maybe your third phase of growth into a new environment, into a new scale of operation, are you doing experiments in terms of management styles, or is this still just, you're just kind of making up and doing whatever opportunistic thing happens? And where are you being inspired?
I wish I had a better answer than saying we don't really know. We're sort of, Google has never had a strategic plan on these questions. You know, what Hal did is Hal came in and serves as our chief economist. And you know, what's funny about Hal is that he's got all of these young people who, it's like having graduate students, except they're working on the business problems of scale of the company. So that's an example where we went from just sort of roughly thinking it's going to work to the science behind running the business. And so it turns out that there's all these incredibly brilliant, you know, mathematically inclined PhDs in economics who are busy working on these questions. So that's an example of an evolution of the model. But it's still basically, you know, Hal and me next to each other having these conversations. But the difference is now we have more rigor. There are many, many examples where the company would do stuff ad hoc, where there are now teams that do it correctly. But the culture, right, the structure of the company has not changed. I worry that we have to change it because we're now 20-something thousand people. And there are issues around scaling human organizations, even with such an attractive model.
So everyone looks to Google as a model. Is there any place, other organization or company that you look to for suggestions and inspiration?
Mostly to negative examples. There's not been a company that grew as quickly in the sort of human side and the expansion side as we have, to my knowledge, in U.S. history. You know, at the rate in terms of headcount and globalization, maybe you know ones that I don't know. So one way to think about Google is we faced every management problem, we just face it faster. And I can repeat the 10 of them. You know, employees vesting out, management topping out, people needing to be promoted, motivational thing, people having other personal crises, lack of coherence, lack of time zone issues, lack of communication, cross-product issues, platforms don't scale, shareholder issues, you know, so forth and so on. We just face them all at once. But we still face them. So one way to answer your question is to say that the future is ambiguous and that the way you want to deal with such ambiguity is to have the smartest people working with you. So what I try to do is I try to the degree that I can, I try to anticipate the problem we're having. And I try to say, okay, you guys, you think you're so smart. Okay, what are we going to do about this? And then that provokes the internal debate.
So maybe last question. Oh, John, one last one, I'll follow up.
Google's been an up-and-comer.
Sure.
Oh, sorry. You guys have been an up-and-comer. You've had wonderful media coverage, and of course, it's been contrasted with Microsoft as the villain. And
so what's wrong with this?
Nothing. But I sense that it's beginning to change. That I'm beginning to see more and more negative articles about Google. And do you guys have a strategy or a proactive way to deal with that? You know, envy begins to seep in as you begin. You're getting on top, and as you get on top, you begin to get attacked, and the negative.
It's actually been true for a long time. We were fortunate that when we were not public, we could sort of hide because nobody knew how well we were doing, although people suspected it. But once we went public and with all the attendant hype, you know, the secret was out. One way of thinking about the press is the press starts here. It's the clock model, basically. You're up and coming, you're exciting, you're incredibly interesting, you're dominant, you're like arrogant, you're like a disaster, you're all screwed up. Then there's an opportunity for resurgence. Okay.
Where are you on the clock?
Well, we believe we're between 6 and 7. And we furthermore believe we will be there essentially forever. And the reason is actually very simple. As long as we're gaining share, which we are globally, we become too powerful. And one of the roles of the press is to keep people from becoming too powerful. And that's a very legitimate role for the press. I'm not criticizing it. It's a reason why our country works and the Fourth Estate exists, and I admire it, and I'm happy to be part of it. So we understand that that's the cycle. They also get tired of writing articles about the food. You know, you just literally get tired of writing the nice, pleasant articles. There must be something wrong with the company, and there certainly are examples. The question is whether it matters. Remember the 4 things I said: end user satisfaction with ads, building the Google network, and growing and scaling the organization. It clearly affects me. Okay. So an example would be that we went public, and we had generally good and mild press. And during the time we went public, we were not allowed to talk to the press under this various quiet period rules from April to August in 2004. And we had the worst press we'd ever seen. Articles about the idiots that we were, and literally just name calling and so forth and so on. And I was very worried that this would affect our brand. And we tracked user traffic, and user traffic exploded, went straight up.
As long as they spell your name right, is that?
That's right. So it does appear that there's, within some limits, I mean, obviously there's some things that you shouldn't do, that the criticism of the incumbent can in fact make the incumbent stronger. It certainly helps us understand how we're viewed. Another example, since you were kind enough to mention Microsoft, it's always a good example for me because I've competed with them so many years. Their high point or low point, depending on your view, was in 1997, prior to the trial. And during the trial, they lost something which it's very hard to get back, which is this sense of the American success story. And if you remember Tom Brokaw's interview with Bill Gates in the early 1994, 1995, wandering around, talking about him about the king of this enormous enterprise and so forth and so on, the press was largely fawning. If you go back and you reconstruct the errors that they made, and I obviously believe that there were many, which ultimately resulted in a conviction, there were signs all along the way. I lived there. And there were many subtle things that they could have done differently, which in my view, would have avoided the loss of something which is very, very important, which is the image of the brand. So one of the things that I do worry about, and try to give you a sort of as crisp and honest an answer, is are those signs out there now, and are we listening? And we can debate that, but that's what we talk about.
So maybe if
you're conscious of it, so if you're conscious, it's probably less of a problem.
Well, but you have to act too.
So I guess maybe the last question is, we hope you have a long and continued career at Google, but if for some reason...
I have 16 years to go.
16 years to go. If for some reason tomorrow you ended up running Boeing or running Motorola or running a company that faces, a different side, making very complicated products, highly interdependent, suppliers all over the world.
So we have all of that.
So what part of the Google model would translate? I mean, what would be the first thing you do in your first 100 days as a CEO if you were in, a much more traditional company with all the legacy that they have?
Well, it's easier to talk about it from my experience at Novell. I went to Novell thinking Novell was a growth company, and I was wrong. It was not a growth company. It was a different kind of company. And I did all the things that you do in a growth company, and it didn't grow because it wasn't a growth company. It was a mature business. So the first question I would always ask if I were parachuted into another company, aside from why did I leave, is what is the nature of the business? Is it really growing? How do we really make money here? And I think the role of a CEO is to be honest with that. Many of the large businesses are really relationship businesses with the government. So they basically, it's really about hiring people who are connected to the government, and that's on the margin how you get your revenue. Right? Other businesses are not really about innovation, they're about capital management. The airlines business is a hopeless business. I have no idea how to solve that. It's always my worst example. What you want to do is you want to figure out, are you in a business that fundamentally has high capital costs and high increasing costs and less, therefore, profits? Or do you have a business where you can get economies of scale from capital investment? So you start going through those sorts of questions, and you have to be honest. And I can tell you, in my experience, having parachuted in, the people who you work with won't tell you the truth because they don't know. So the single most important thing that you can do, and I suspect those of you who are able to do consulting and so forth are probably in this situation, is try to understand how the business actually works as opposed to what the people are telling you. In Google, for example, we have a wonderful sales force, and we say it's the greatest sales force in the world. By the way, every company says it has the greatest sales force in the world. I can tell you the way we make our quarter is we control the dials on our advertising system. Sales guys have relatively little to do with making the quarter. They're very important because they cause the order book to be filled. But we can decide whatever numbers we want per quarter just by changing the dials of our advertising system. It's very important to know that. Another example, 97% of our revenue comes from text ads. I love text ads, right? If 97% of your business is in a business, you better love it, right? You know, when I was going to become CEO of Novell, I wandered around and I asked for CEO training because I figured all these people know something, and everyone was very kind. So Bill Gates told me, you should spend 80% of your time on 80% of your revenue, right? Perfectly reasonable. It's very easy. It's very, very easy as an executive to get confused. Like this press question. Does it really matter? Right. Now, it obviously matters to me, but does it really matter? Because the way you lose your job as a CEO is revenue and earnings growth.
Can demoralize your organization.
Well, but it's fine to have a demoralized organization as long as you have a high stock price and make a lot of money. My point is that it's very, very easy. Everybody always has all of these arguments. The easiest way to lose your job as a CEO is to have revenue going the wrong way. So when I started at Google, I said that we have a very simple rule here. We're going to have absolute profits are going to increase every quarter. I'm not talking about growth rate. I'm talking about absolute profits. Very simple. We'll figure out a way to do that. Go work on that. Because it seems to me that as long as absolute profits are growing, it's very hard to complain. All we're arguing about then is growth rate. Because I've been on the other side. And so I think when I think about, I'm not trying to give a sort of color. The businesses that you're describing are either growing or not. They either have capital available for them to invest or they don't. They either have these structural impediments or they don't. They often waste a lot of money on things that aren't very important compared to the things that I said first. And I think the most important job of a CEO is to know the answer to that question. And then the test of you as the CEO is whether you can maneuver through the culture. At Novell, I had an employee meeting in Utah, and this very nice lady came up, introduced herself, and said, I said, you know, I was just in the company. What do you do? Oh, I'm the fleet manager. And I said, oh, we have a fleet. A fleet of what? Cars. Again, it's amazing what you learn. So we got rid of the cars, but that's right. Anyway, you get the idea.
All right, thanks, Eric, very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay.